journey down the rabbit hole of rock and roll's past, present, and future. It's Barstool Rockers with your hosts, Jim Finn and Dan Michaels.
This is the part of the podcast where we do the open, the introduction to what it is we're going to talk about today.
And sometimes we actually make them entertaining, folks.
Sometimes.
Welcome to
not always, but sometimes.
Welcome to the sometimes entertaining Barstool Rockers podcast, where your hosts try to figure out a way to get into the meat, and then we get to the meat, and then we try to bring the meat home to you, cooked and ready to go. There you go. How you doing today?
Oh, wow, that is a great analogy.
Yeah, sure, why not? Today, we were both once younger, and that's most people's story in life that they stick to. Most bands were younger at one time too.
Unbelievable how that works.
I know. And there was a band called R.E.M. at one time, and they were part of the Athens scene with the B-52s and a bunch of other bands. And B-52s weren't really classic rock. R.E.M. is considered classic rock these days, and they were kind of a bulldozer at one point in time.
Yeah, they were a big deal.
Anything they did, it was huge.
I'm kind of surprised that they hung it up.
Yeah. What was the driving force behind that?
Well, after Bill Berry had his aneurysm, they continued on for a while, and they released some pretty interesting records. Notice how I said records.
Well, they were.
But they put out some good stuff. But then I just think, I don't know if it was all of them or if it was just Stipe just kind of wanted to give it a rest. They had done, how Seinfeld went out on top.
Yeah.
And they kind of wanted to not draw it out.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And a man with a perspective about that is Robert Dean Lurie. He's written a book called Begin the Begin.
All right, let's talk about this new book that you have, R.E.M., The Early Years, Begin the Begin. Talk about how this band started out, of course, by the mid-'80s. From somewhere after Green and Document, these guys were already on their way to superstardom. But for R.E.M., it started on a much more low-key basis, right?
That's right. So R.E.M. played their first quote-unquote concert at a birthday party in April 1980. And they didn't even have a name at that point. Basically, it was a group of friends. They kind of had one friend in common, and they had been put together just kind of randomly. And they were such a huge hit at this party, mainly playing cover songs by early 60s artists and the Monkees and stuff like that. They were such a huge hit at the party that overnight they became one of the biggest bands in Athens, Georgia, where everyone lived. At that point, 3 of the 4 members were enrolled in the University of Georgia. So very quickly, they were a big fish in a small pond. And there was this really thriving music scene in Athens, Georgia, and they were a big part of that. And then kind of through a lot of do-it-yourself ethos, they started making themselves known regionally. They were signed to IRS Records. They very quickly built up a following, particularly in the network of college radio stations. So, like the baseball analogy would be that they were in the minor leagues, but there's a lot of people that feel that this early stuff was actually some of their best work, if not their best work. And eventually, as you mentioned in your question, they broke through and they became a big mainstream act.
Now, where did CMJ, Collegiate Music Journal, come into play? Because I remember getting contacted by record reps when I was working in college radio, and they were huge on R.E.M., and CMJ was really promoting them as well.
Yeah, I mean, CMJ, that was a really big deal. I did some music when so I guess to back up, I also went to University of Georgia, but it was later on. And I remember that was the big thing to get a mention in CMJ. There was a connection between IRS Records, which had a lot of bands that were being played on the college radio stations. And CMJ was kind of the publication that pulled it all together and that had the charts and everything. So, yeah, they were on board very early.
You had mentioned the cover versions that they were playing of songs. While I was perusing through the book, I found it comical that they were actually doing a cover version of Rush's Working Man.
Yeah, well, actually, that predates R.E.M. slightly because that was Michael Stipe's debut vocal performance. And I believe this is breaking news. I don't think he's ever mentioned that before. That was his first time on stage. I think it was a mix of, they did, I think, Gimme Shelter, and then they did Working Man. And that was also a unnamed band. I think eventually the yearbook said that they were just called The Band. Mm-hmm. But that was at Collinsville High School in Illinois. And then just a couple years later, he's in R.E.M.
Now, they were huge darlings on MTV. Where did they play in the propulsion of R.E.M. to the top?
MTV was also a big deal, and R.E.M. kind of had they had mixed feelings about music videos. So Michael Stipe had been an art school student and was very much into visuals, and so he was interested in the medium of film. But the other guys, especially Peter Buck, thought that was a distraction from music. And so it's funny when you watch the videos, when they do show up in the videos, a lot of times the other guys look pretty bored or sleepy in the background. And then you have Michael Stipe and whatever directors were working on the videos, trying to put some interesting ideas across. But yeah, I mean, going back to the video for Radio Free Europe, which is their first single, MTV was a big part of it, and again, IRS Records had a relationship with MTV. There was a show that was sponsored by IRS Records called The Cutting Edge, which was the first of those kind of late-night programs on MTV that showed these left-of-center bands. Later on you had 120 Minutes, but The Cutting Edge was the first of those, and R.E.M. they dominated that. Anything that R.E.M. had on film would be shown on that.
Well, now, obviously, you were interested enough in telling this story of their early years. What do you think? Obviously, they had an enigmatic frontman, and they started writing some just amazing songs. I mean, Perfect Circle, and trying to think back to some of those South Central Rain, some of those early tunes. What do you think it was about the combination of those guys that made R.E.M. become what they were?
That's a really good question, because it is precisely the mix of music that was pretty direct and catchy with lyrics that were pretty obscure. So prior to R.E.M., it was usually one or the other thing. You might have a band that has catchy melodies and they're singing about cars and girls and Saturday night and stuff like that. Or you might have another band, all of the art rock bands fall into this category where everything is experimental. So R.E.M. was kind of this collision because, again, you had Peter Buck was into the Monkees, Mike Mills was into Bachman-Turner Overdrive. You have all these kind of things that you wouldn't associate with R.E.M. on the music side, kind of fueling the creative process in terms of creating the tunes. Then you had Michael Stipe, who was into literature, he's into art. He had sort of almost like a scrambler in his brain where you might have heard of the cut-up technique, this idea that you write a poem and you cut it up.
Sure. Bowie did that all the time, yeah.
Yeah, and Stipe seemed to have that just in his brain. So he didn't need to cut anything up, it just came out that way. And over time, the songs became more direct as he developed things that he wanted to say. But I think it was just so different. You could hum along to it, you could dance to it, but then you could also sort of puzzle over it, and it just became a fun game trying to figure out what those songs were about.
The book is Begin the Beguine, the early years for R.E.M. Robert, we got to let you go. We know you're on a schedule today. Thanks for taking some time and chatting with us.
Hey, thank you so much for your interest in the book.
That one really took me back. It takes you back to those early years.
Yeah.
Talking about Cutting Edge and 120 Minutes. You remember
and
all
my
that?
days of sitting in a tiny radio station in Iowa talking to the people from CMJ.
Oh,
There's a lot of fond memories and a lot of, God, I wish I hadn't have done that memories too. So
Well, and the IRS label, that thing was huge for a while. Wall of Voodoo, Mexican radio.
Oh, my God.
It was on there. Yeah, Stan Ridgway and Wall of Voodoo. God, that takes me, I got a whole bunch of stuff I have to listen to now today.
Mrs. Finn, I'm sorry.
You apologize
I'm very,
in advance.
very sorry. A lot of good notes on his book, though, for Begin the Beguine, and a lot of other authors are saying they really like it. So I'm hoping there's stuff in there for the diehard R.E.M. fans, and hopefully they'll be picking up on some insight as well.
Swenny, I'm talking to you. Got a friend, Jeff Swenson, big, huge R.E.M. fan, so you should probably check this one out. And I'd actually like to have a little bit more time with Robert Dean Lurie to talk a little bit more about the band, because we had a short one today.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see his perspective on how that whole MTV game played out and what all was involved in that. You know, someday I'd like to get a hold of somebody and talk about the behind-the-scenes world of MTV.
Well, and isn't it just like a front man to be the guy in the videos that's really into it, but everybody else is just kind of,
okay.
It's not that way with every band, but there's a lot of bands.
Exactly. So anyway, if you enjoyed what we do on this podcast, it's called Barstool Rockers. Please consider giving us a favorable rating and subscribing at iTunes, Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, or wherever you're listening to us. Every positive review helps new listeners find the show. You may listen to some of these things. They get huge staffs, and they give the credits at the end. For us, it's Finn and me.
Yeah.
Some help from Anastasia Vishnevsky, who created our music, and Joe Kelly, the guy with the voice larger than life. If you know of somebody who may enjoy what we're doing or have a social media connection you'd like to share it on, we love that. It helps get the word out and helps us grow this podcast into something that we may someday actually make a buck or two on.
Help us, please.
For more information about today's episode and to contact us, you can visit the website barstoolrockers.com, or you can get us hold of us by emailing barstoolrockers@gmail.com. On Facebook, it is called Barstool Rockers. And of course, thank you for listening.
Until next time.